On the 15th of April 1912, on board an upside-down lifeboat, 30 men began to witness a significant and dark event in maritime history. The lifeboat that held the men was Collapsible Lifeboat B. Collapsible Lifeboat B and the men who were on her were key witnesses to the sinking of the White Star Liner. However, this boat hasn't been fully documented. This documentary is about to change all that. From Second Officer Charles Lightoller and his near brush to death near the boat, the Colonel, who nearly went down with the Titanic before her final plunge, and the teen who helped an oceanographer to locate the ship's resting place. This is the story of Collapsible Lifeboat B and her men. The haunting words from a 17-year-old survivor, Jack Thayer III, recalls how the sinking changed the world by questioning authority and why technology and man have failed to recognize the dangers of sea travel. Before April 1912, neither of these problems had mattered to society, even to those who were confident in Titanic's design. Over a century later, it is a different story. The world has international ice patrol and safety regulations at sea, though in recent events of the OceanGate tragedy, some of the regulations may be re-advised and updated. When the Titanic was beginning her maiden voyage, her lifeboats and the safety protocols weren't taken or thought of professionally or seriously, especially with lifeboat drills and evacuations. Even though there was crew training, some regulations were outdated, and Collapsible Lifeboat B became a witness to all of this. So what is the story of Collapsible Lifeboat B? The story of the collapsible boat begins at Queen's Island in Belfast, Ireland, where 20 Engelhart lifeboats were built while the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic, were being constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Collapsible Lifeboat B was built by Scottish boat builders McAllister and Son. The company is known for building yachts and lifeboats, and in May of 1911, 1 month before the Olympics' main voyage, the company agreed with a Danish captain to build collapsible lifeboats in February of 1912. The company delivered the Engelhart lifeboats to Belfast, where they would be fitted onto the Titanic. The design was supervised by Chief Ship's Draftsman Roderick Chisholm, who had worked at the shipyard for over 2 decades. By 1912, Chisholm was one of the few men who worked alongside Thomas Andrews, Jr., the main ship designer. He was at the forefront in the designs of the Olympics and the Titanics and became one member of the Guarantee Group, who would oversee the Titanic during her main voyage. While the lifeboats were made by local designers, the lifeboat davits were designed by Axel Wellen and supplied by the Wellen Davin Company. Wellen was a Swedish inventor and industrialist who owned his engineering firm. He was interested in davits, and it was because of his interest that he invented the Wellen davits, a series of quadrant davits for double-banked boats. Titanic's Engelhart collapsible lifeboats were designed to measure 27 feet and 5 inches long, 8 feet broad, and 3 feet deep. It also had a capacity of 47 people. However, the capacity was based on the tonnage of the vessel, which was legal at the time. Alongside B, the vessel had 3 other lifeboats, A, C, and D. Although the keels were made up of a combination of elm, oak, yellow pine, and copper nails, Lifeboat B could meet the Board of Trade regulations. They also have a cast brass plaque with the letters SS Titanic on them. When the Titanic and the Olympic were built, the British Board of Trade regulations required vessels to supply lifeboats with sails, stowed in painted bags, a compass, a water beaker, and sea anchors. Neither of these would be used.
The purpose of lifeboats around when the Titanic was around was to save lives, to save human lives in the event of a tragedy, a sinking, or if the ship was in any immediate danger. The the British Board of Trade was basically a law that regulated safety at sea. That means i.e. lifeboats and life jackets and everything else. So basically, a ship could not be cleared without the British Board of Trade certificate. So that was basically the British Board of Trade. So they worked for the government, and I believe they still do. I think the British Board of Trade is still around to this day. But again, like I say, they do tend to regulate the safety on the oceans. But the other purpose of lifeboats was back in 1912 or in the earlier 20th century was lifeboats were not really built to. They were like ferries, tiny ferries that were supposed to transfer people from the ship that was in immediate danger to another vessel, because usually when ships sink, they usually sink in shipping lanes where usually there's a ship around to come to the rescue. But as we know with Titanic, that kind of put an end to that notion of, okay, there's always going to be a ship around when a ship is in trouble.
When put on board the Titanic, it was decided that Collapsible A and Collapsible B were to be latched onto the roof of the officers' quarters, and this meant that they had to be brought down to the boat deck if they needed to be lowered in an emergency. This would turn into a grave mistake. On the 2nd of April 1912, the Titanic began her sea trials in Belfast. The weather was clear with a light breeze, though the vessel was 24 hours behind schedule due to hazardous conditions. When it was given the all-clear, the Titanic was pulled out into the River Lagan by 5 tugboats before going through a series of tests to prove she was seaworthy. Junior wireless operator Harold Bride was one of the few men who signed up to the Titanic, and he was there to test out the Marconi wireless equipment when the ship was being examined. Bride had also joined the Marconi Company the previous July and had experience working on 2 ships before the Titanic. On board, he met John Jack Phillips, the senior operator. However, although the company owns the White Star Line, Bride and Phillips were hired from the International Mercantile Marine Company and not from White Star. Alongside them was Harold A. Sanderson, who was a representative of the company. While the men were testing out the equipment in the wireless room, they noticed that while the sets and signals were functioning, they noticed a small error when the transmitter was subjected to a heavy workload. This wasn't the first time, as the secondary transformer windings had a habit of shorting to the metal casing. However, the problem was found when Captain Smith sent a workload of messages and reports to J. Bruce Ismay. Luckily, Bride, Phillips, and Sanderson sent separate messages to coast stations at Malin Head, Seaforth, the Lizard, and Netton near the Isle of Wight. The problem was solved when the wireless operators figured out the technical issue. Also on board were Second Officer Charles Lightoller and the Chief Baker Charles Yaukin. Lightoller began his career at sea at the age of 13, and by the time he was 38 years of age, he had plenty of experience and raised many ranks. He began working for the White Star Line in 1900, and before joining the Titanic, he last sailed on the RMS Oceanic as a first officer. In a recording from the BBC radio program I Was There, Lightoller explained his impressions of participating in the ship's sea trials sailing as a first officer.
I joined her in Belfast while she was still in the builder's hand. The biggest and finest ship in the world, and given the normal life of the ship, I'm pretty sure she would have proved the fastest. But let me say right here and now, neither that night nor that voyage were we out for any records.
Later on, Captain Smith made changes to the positions of his crew. Lightoller was dropped down to second officer following the departure of David Blair and bringing on Henry Watt as chief officer and Officer William Murdoch as first officer. This would turn out to be the first of a series of events that would have fatal consequences. As a boy himself, Yaukin had training in baking and pastry. When he began to work at sea, he was enlisted into the Royal British Navy and earned a position in the White Star Line, where he worked on the Majestic, beginning as a second baker. By the time he worked on the Titanic, he had transferred to her from the sister ship the Olympic. He signed up to join the crew on the 4th, 2 days after the ship arrived in Southampton. On board, he would spend his time cooking in the ship's bakery, where he supervised a group of 13 bakers who would make different types of breads and breakfast pastries for passengers to enjoy. After her sea trials, the Titanic sailed on a 28-hour trip to her first destination, Southampton. She would remain in Southampton docks for 6 days at berth 44. However, her maiden voyage had been disrupted due to an ongoing coal strike, which led to a change in crew members and a transfer of passengers from other liners. On 9th of April, Maurice Clark, an immigration officer for the Board of Trade, inspected the ship for a final time before he signed her off, passing her safety regulation exams. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Thomas Andrews Jr., Charles Lightoller, and the rest of the crew joined the Titanic. Captain Smith came on board at 7:30 a.m. Doctors suspected crew members to make sure they were well for sailing, and there was a lifeboat drill witnessed by Clark and the White Star Marine Superintendent Captain Benjamin Steele.
The early drill was to basically to prepare. Well, it was to train the officers and the crew how to lower and bring the lifeboat back up. So it was just basically to lower one of the lifeboats, or maybe two of the lifeboats, down into the ocean, and then just to bring them back up, to basically please the British Board of Trade that they knew what they were doing in the event of any danger. So that was the early drill.
During the drill, the lifeboats were lowered into the water and rowed around the waterfront for a couple of turns before returning to the ship. When the drills were complete, the Titanic was ready to set sail. Later in the day, passengers arrived at the docks, with most arriving in boat trains from London Waterloo Station, which took them to the berth. Other passengers arrived from hotels nearby where they stayed overnight. This included the Southwestern Hotel, where J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, and his family stayed before departure day. Joining Ismay was first-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie, who was returned to America after attending a funeral in England. With him, he traveled with 3 ladies, all unaccompanied family friends. But unlike first class, where you can just walk on board the ship, third class passengers had to go through a series of medical exams before boarding. This was done to ensure that the passengers were clean and healthy for the voyage. All the exams were led by doctors who were required to check for lice and diseases. If passengers showed symptoms, they weren't allowed to board the Titanic. One of the third class passengers who boarded the ships and passed the medical exams was a groomer named Edward Dorkins, who boarded the Titanic to make a new life in Illinois and join his uncle and aunt. At noon, the Titanic blew her whistles and began her departure. As she turned to a river test, Titanic's propellers created a giant suction which forced another liner, the SS City of New York.
The Titanic was sailing down Southampton, down the docks, down into the ocean. They were going towards the ocean as it left, and as it was sailing down, the engines had there was a couple of ships that were docked as Titanic passed, and Titanic's engines has suction from the propellers, it's kind of snapped the ropes of the New York, and the New York drifted towards Titanic. And many passengers saw this, and a lot of them thought it was a bad omen as well. In the world, it was very religious based. People were very superstitious and very especially religious people, and so, to be honest, so were seafarers as well. And they thought that the near collision with the New York was a bad omen, and so the New York was drawn into the Titanic. So luckily, the tugs managed to get hold of the New York and pull her back away from Titanic. And obviously, Captain Smith did his maneuvers as well to avoid that collision from taking place. But it was very, very close. And a lot of people say that if the incident had taken place, maybe Titanic may have not met her eventual end.
In the evening, the Titanic arrived in Cherbourg to pick up more passengers before heading over to Queenstown in south of Ireland. Another group of first-class passengers who boarded her from Cherbourg were the Thayer family. The president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, John Thayer II, American socialite Miriam Thayer, their son John Thayer III, or Jack to his family, and their maid Margaret Fleming. Jack was traveling home with his parents after an extended European vacation when they booked first-class tickets. Luckily for the 17-year-old Jack, he was given freedom on board the Titanic, including having his room next door to his parents. and one of the last passengers to join in Queenstown was Eugene Daly. Daly was a wool heaver who wanted to make a new life for himself, booking a ticket to board as a third-class passenger. He traveled on board with a relative of his, Margaret Daly. The Titanic left Queenstown in the early afternoon, never to see land again. As the Titanic sailed away from Queenstown, Daly was reported to have a song on his Irish uilleann pipes. For the first few days at sea, all was well on board the ship. Passengers were settling into their rooms and crew members were beginning their way to familiarize themselves with the decks. All around the class areas, first class were enjoying a high luxurious life with food, musical entertainment, and a variety of activities to do, including a gymnasium, Turkish baths, and a swimming pool with salt-heated water. One first-class passenger who had a splendid time on board was Colonel Archibald Gracie, who would recall how he was about the Titanic. "I enjoyed myself as if I were in a summer palace on the seashore, surrounded with every comfort. There was nothing to indicate or suggest that we were on the stormy Atlantic Ocean." Gracie was spending most of his time participating in the early morning exercises, having felt the guilt that he was neglecting his physical health whatsoever. He would also spend time in the first-class library or with a small group known as our coterie, a group of writers who discuss works of literature and chaperone unaccompanied women.
Passengers were settling in. They were really enjoying, especially, the third class commented how beautiful the ship was. To me, first class, they were very impressed with the Titanic and very impressed with its grandeur and its beautiful, how beautiful it was, and having the joys of having to be able to send messages from the ocean, by wireless, and all the gizmos that Titanic had that other vessels didn't have in those times. Titanic offered the most grandest of accommodations in any ship in its time, but third class is in particular. You've got to imagine these came from poor classes. Very poor families, and they sometimes wouldn't even had central heating or hot running tap water and things like that. People even probably thought they would have thought, have I actually got on the vessel? Am I in a hotel or something? It was really wonderful for people. Third class was sometimes better than second class in some ships. So sailing on the Titanic was just, it was like being in a 5-star hotel, if not more, because it was just a palace on the ocean. She really was.
The Thayer family spent their time roaming around the ship, and although Jack would accompany his parents for strolls on the decks, meeting with J. Bruce Ismay, Thomas Andrews, president of the Grail Trunk Railway of Canada, Charles M. Hayes, but Jack would spend time on his own, and while on board, he would befriend Milton Long, a clerk from Massachusetts who was traveling alone. Eugene Daly would spend most of his time moving around the general room and common areas on F and G decks, where he would play music on his uilleann pipes. His pipes brought a lot of joy to third-class passengers, particularly the ladies, including passenger Katie Gilnott. Behind the scenes whatsoever, the crew would begin their duties, making sure that the ship would be and that everything was running on time. From the lookouts taking their shifts in the crow's nest to the saloon stewards who would serve food to the tables that the cooks inside the kitchens would prepare hours before. Some had worked on previous White Star liners like the RMS Oceanic II and the Olympic, which is Titanic's sister ship. One crew member was stewardess Violet Jessup, who had worked on the RMS Olympic, and having survived the ship's collision with a naval cruiser a year before, Jessup would be amazed at the marvel of the Olympic's younger sister. In her memoir, Jessup would describe the environment and the people she had met on board the Titanic. Getting acquainted either with people or a ship is not an easy matter in bad weather. Both show is the worst advantage under unflattering conditions, but in this case, nothing prevented the spread of harmonious peace and good fellowship. Down below on the saloon deck, Chief Baker Charles Yelkin and a team of 14 men with 2 confectioners who were responsible for preparing pies and sweets and 12 bakers who prepared the bread, including second baker John Davis and Veda baker George William Feltham, who had been responsible for making rolls and pastries. During the Maiden voyage, the bakers would have worked in 2 rooms. These 2 rooms were the baker shops, where the bread and sweets would be made, and the bakehouse, where the bread and sweets were put into the oven before being served to passengers and crew. Also, there was a baker shop for third-class passengers down on F deck. Although working hours on the ship's kitchens are well known, records of the working hours for the bakers would have been lost to history. However, there is one little clue where one record suggests an extra third baker, Charles Burgess, along with third baker William Hine, and 2 bakers shared a shift at 9 p.m. From a historian's point of view, this could mean that the bakery staff would work 15-hour shifts from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. and possibly split into different time slots. As for Yelkin, he would have gotten up before 8 a.m. every morning, and once he was beginning the day, he would see the boat list for the kitchen staff that would be posted on the galley. However, it's impossible to determine if Yelkin shared shifts with the same or various with the second, third, extra, or assistant bakers. However, if Yelkin wasn't busy working, he would have had extra time to bake Irish soda bread for his acquaintance, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews Jr. Yelkin knew how easily homesick Andrews was whenever he left his family behind in Belfast, and he would always bake the bread so Andrews could eat it inside his cabin. Outside the kitchen, Sidney Daniels, a third-class steward, was regarded for his hard work. Daniels had previously worked on the Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic, and by the time he boarded the Titanic, Daniels was living in Portsmouth, but he signed on to the Titanic, Southampton, on the 8th of April. According to his daughter, Jean Legge, who gave an interview in 2012, Daniels was 17 years old when he boarded the Olympic as a trainee steward before being selected to join the Titanic, which was considered as a great honor. As a third-class steward, Daniels would have been responsible for preparing food and working in the third-class smoking room, though it isn't clear where he worked on board the Titanic. In the boiler rooms, James McGann, a trimmer who had been given tasks of shoveling coal from the bunkers before putting the lumps into wheelbarrows to be delivered to the firemen. Although the trimmers had responsibility for distributing the coal to keep the Titanic on an even keel, the tasks that were required could have been dangerous, especially in rough weather conditions. For a lump of coal, which weighs between 40 and 84 pounds per lump, could fall on somebody if it moved out of the bunker in the dark where there was no light down below. McGann signed on the Titanic before the ship left Southampton docks on the 10th of April. Before joining, he had worked on the South Africa, also working as a trimmer. High above the boiler room and in the Marconi wireless room, Harold Bride and his colleague Jack Phillips were working on a series of sending private telegrams for passengers, which is mainly first-class passengers. This was their main duty, though they would receive other telegrams from ships informing the crew and the captain about ice within the route the Titanic was sailing in. However, on the night of the 13th, Phillips was on his shift when he had trouble with a wireless machine. Not long after 11 p.m., the apparatus broke down. Afterwards, Phillips woke up Bride, who was asleep in the Marconi cabin, and the pair began to work on finding the resolution to fix it. But there was one problem, though. Fixing a machine was against company rules. In the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company's policy, should apparatus break down, the operators should not attempt to fix it until the vessel reached dry land. But hey, being the rule breakers that they are, Bride and Phillips rummaged around the mechanisms that were inside the machine. When they found what was wrong, the men learned that the apparatus leads from the secondary of the transformer had burnt through the casings, which damaged some of the iron bolts. Phillips attempted to fix this apparatus with rubber tape, and that did the trick. By 5:30 a.m. ship's time, the machine was back up and running. However, there was a backlog of messages that needed to be sent, so Phillips returned to work. He wouldn't get any sleep for the rest of the voyage. On the morning of the 14th of April 1912, the Titanic's engines were recorded to have been running at 75 RPM, which made Titanic's top speed reach 22 knots. In the boiler rooms, trimmer James McGann would have either been on duty, having his breakfast inside the stoker's mess room on C deck, or asleep in his sleeping quarters, where he and the other trimmers would share quarters and washrooms of their own, which is likely located between D and G decks. In the ship's stokeholds, they were organized in 3 watches, and they would have worked 12-hour shifts for each watch. one between 8 a.m. to noon, the second between noon to 4 p.m., and the third between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. McGann would have done either of those things, though there's no record of exactly what happened to him during the entire voyage. However, it was noted that the Titanic's boilers were making good progress, although 21 out of the 29 boilers were lit on that morning. As the sun rose, first-class passenger Colonel Gracie was preparing for the day before he began his usual morning route on board. When he completed his activities and had breakfast, Gracie would attend a Sunday morning service led by Captain Smith, which took place in the first-class dining saloon and began at 10:30. According to Margaret Brown, another first-class passenger, 1.5 of the passengers attended the service, including Gracie himself. In his memoir, Gracie would describe what had occurred during that Sunday morning service. I remember how much I was impressed with a prayer for those at sea. Also the words of the hymn, which we sang, number 418 of the hymnal. What a remarkable coincidence that the first and last ship service on board the Titanic, the hymn we sang began with these impressive lines, O God, our help in our ages past, our hope for years to come, a shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. However, Gracie's description of the hymn Eternal Father Strong to Save, or Prayer for Those at Sea, is up for discussion and debate, as there is no further evidence to suggest that this hymn was sung that morning. What is known that 5 out of the 8 musicians who boarded as second-class passengers, led by violinist Wallace Hartley, provided music for the service. They would also play at the Anglican and Catholic services in the second-class dining saloon. In second class, another Sunday morning service also took place in the second-class dining saloon. However, 2 more services also took place, an Anglican service that occurred in the early morning that was led by Assistant Purser Reginald Lawman Baker, while Catholic and Lutheran services in the second-class lounge and library. In third class, there was a mixture of Christian, Greek Orthodox, and Jewish services. When the first-class Sunday service concluded in the last 45 minutes of the day, Colonel Gracie left the service, spent time in the library before he spent time in the conversation with Isidore and Ida Strauss, and having a discussion with Isidore Strauss on Gracie's book, The Truth About Chickamauga. Meanwhile, outside the library, Jack Thayer and his parents spent most of the day walking around the decks and having discussions with other promenaders. However, Thayer would describe the weather as having been noticeably colder as the afternoon wore on. Thayer went on to say when he met up with J. Bruce Ismay, he was showing him and his parents how wire regarding the presence of ice and remarking that we would not reach that position until around 9 p.m. Thayer didn't make it clear who sent the message, but it is known that the message was from the Baltic. But there was a story where Ismay put the Baltic's warning message inside his pocket instead of taking it to the bridge or chart room. However, was this story true? Well, to understand this, we need to go back to the telegram itself. At 1:42 p.m., Captain Smith received a telegram from the commander on the SS Baltic. It read, Greek steamer Atheniae report passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice today at latitude 41 degrees north, longitude 49 degrees 52 west. In the 1915 Liberty hearings led by Lord Mersey, Ismay was recorded to have said that it would be a natural thing to put the messages or marconigrams in the chart room on the officer's board, and that he was familiar with that practice. Now, I will come to the question on the Baltic telegram. Did you before that particular Sunday know what was the practice with regard to marconigrams received by the officers on the ship relating to the navigation of the ship? Did you know what it was the practice to do with those marconigrams as soon as they had been received? I believe the practice was to put them in the chart room for the officers. Did you know that on Sunday, April 14th? The answer was yes. I presume that would be the natural thing to do. That answer was correct, was it? At what time you gave it? Yes, I do not see there is very much difference in the two. Is there? There may be. This marconigram from the Baltic was a message affecting navigation, was it not? If the ice was in the track, yes, it would be. How did you happen to keep the message in your pocket? I simply put it in my pocket, and I thought nothing more about it. However, first-class passenger Emily Ryerson tells another side of the story. In a letter she wrote, dated 18th of April 1913, Miss Ryerson stated that at 6 p.m. ship's time, she and Mary and Thayer were on the promenade deck when Ismay approached the ladies and showing them the telegram from the Baltic. It is understood that before having a conversation with Miss Ryerson and Mrs. Thayer, Captain Smith gave the Baltic's message in person. Mr. Ismay thrust a Marconigram at me saying we were in among the icebergs. They were to start up the extra boilers that afternoon. My impression was that they were speeding the ship up to get away from the ice, and that we would probably get in late Tuesday or early Wednesday morning. Mr. Ismay's manner was that of one in authority and the owner of the ship, and what he said was law. While in conversation, Miss Ryerson said that the captain approached Ismay and asked him to return the ice warning so he could post it in the chart room. Ismay did it, and it remained in his possession until he was told once again by the Master-at-Arms Thomas Walter King. He posted it in the chart room at 7:15 p.m. Although the evidence for this story is strong, we know that Ismay denied what people said about him ordering the ship to go faster in the U.S. inquiry. Did you have the occasion to consult with the captain about the movement of the ship? Never. Did he consult you about it? Never. Perhaps I am wrong in saying that. I should like to say this. I do not know that it was quite a matter of consulting him about it, of his consulting me about it, but what we had to arrange to do was that we would not attempt to arrive in New York at the light ship before 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning. That was the understanding. Yes, but that was arranged before we left Queenstown. Was it supposed that you could reach New York at that time without putting the ship to its full running capacity? Oh, yes, sir. There was nothing to be gained by arriving at New York any earlier than that. Ismay also explained about the Titanic's speed. You spoke of the revolutions on the early part of the voyage? Yes, sir. Those were increased as its distance was increased. The Titanic being a new ship, we were gradually working her up. When you bring a new ship, you naturally do not start her running at a full speed until you get everything working smoothly and satisfactorily down below. So during the voyage, do you know of your own acknowledgement of your proximity to the icebergs? Did I know we were near icebergs? Yes. No, sir, I did not. I know ice had been reported. Ice had been reported? Yes. Have you ever been on this so-called northern route before? We were on the southern route, sir. On this Newfoundland route? We were on the long southern route, not the northern route. You were not on the extreme northern route? We were on the extreme southern route for the westbound ships. Were you aware of the proximity of icebergs on Sunday? On Sunday? No, I did not know on Sunday. I knew that we would be in the ice region that night sometime. That you would be, or were? That we would be in the ice region on Sunday night. Did you have any consultation with the captain regarding the matter? Absolutely none. Or with any of the officers of the ship? With no officer at all, sir. It was absolutely out of my province. I am not a navigator. I was simply a passenger on board the ship. From each testimony, there's no full conclusion to this, but what we know that when the Baltic message was sent, Captain Smith showed Ismay the telegram, and Ismay was in his presence. Another incident which occurred but could have been prevented a disaster was several missed ice warnings during the day or when the Marconi apparatus was out of action. When the Marconi manual guidelines were broken by Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the men would have been under pressure to receive and reply to messages from other ships in Cape Race while sending backlogs of passenger messages, including one from Isidore and Ida Strauss, who sent a message to their son. By the afternoon, ice warnings came in from the Baltic, as well as the Caronia, the America, the Californian, and the Meziba. However, only one warning from the Caronia went through to the bridge and was posted in the Titanic's chart room. This message was sent from the Meziba, which came at around 9:52 p.m. ship's time. From Meziba to Titanic and other eastbound ships, ice report in latitude 42 degrees north, 41 degrees 25 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees to 50 degrees 30 minutes west. Saw much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs. Also field ice, weather is good, clear. However, with the missing message from the Meziba that was never delivered to the bridge, Lightoller and the crew weren't informed about the icebergs that were far off course and heading straight towards the transatlantic route. In his radio interview, Charles Lightoller described the actions he would have taken should the other ice warnings go through the bridge.
On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of the year, and had taken all necessary precautions. Now, throughout the day, there had been the usual wireless messages from different ships reporting the weather, odd icebergs, and so forth. But as none of these bergs reported lay on our course, well, they didn't directly concern us. But when the evidence came to be sifted out at the inquiry held in London afterwards, it then came out that one very vital message received in the Titanic's wireless room that night had never been delivered to the bridge. That message came from a ship called the Masaba, warning all ships of heavy pack ice, icebergs, and field ice in an area then lying right ahead of the Titanic, and what was still worse, not far away. Those immense quantities of ice were abnormal for almost any time of the year, and the significance we should have attached to that report can hardly be exaggerated. In my opinion, it was a warning of the most vital importance. You see, I was officer of the watch and in charge of the ship when that Masaba message came over, and I know perfectly well what I should have done if it had come to my hand. Without a shadow of doubt, I should have slowed her down at once. That would have been imperative, and sent for the captain. More than likely, in fact almost certainly, he would have stopped the ship altogether and waited for daylight to feel his way through.
If things were different, then the Titanic would have stopped in mid-ocean and everyone could have survived, and with the only consequence being that the ship would arrive a day or two late to New York. Another mystery was a rumored canceled lifeboat drill. In previous statements, and with the topic of being the main feature in various documentaries, Captain Edward J. Smith seemed to be blamed for canceling the drills for the crew members because he wanted to lead in what would have been his final church service as captain before his retirement. That and thinking it wouldn't be fair if a drill would occur in the morning, delaying services in all three classes. Even though there were drills on the 25th of March, 2nd and 10th of April, it was strange to think that the drills were cancelled for this purpose, when in fact, this isn't the case whatsoever. On the morning of the 14th, the Titanic was traveling at 546 nautical miles by noon and recorded speed at 22.06 knots, with a time interval of 24 hours and 45 minutes after beginning a separate recording dating from the noon on the 13th. By the time the Titanic entered the Labrador Current on the 13th, the temperature was starting to cool down. However, on the morning of the 14th, there was a source that suggested that a strong wind had occurred after dawn. According to Lookout Archie Jewell, the real reason for the cancellation was because of strong winds and the rain. This is proven when he was interviewed in the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry. Is it not an unusual thing when there is a boat practice to call to the boat deck all the men who are expecting an emergency to go with that boat? Yes, once on the trip, once going out and once coming home. Twice on the trip. Had this been done on this trip? No, it is generally done on the Sunday, but it was not done on that day. There was a strong wind. Had it been done on that day? No, it was blowing hard that day. There was a strong wind that day, and that was the reason why it was not done. A strong wind on what day? On the Sunday. This meant that on every single voyage Captain Smith was on, including the Titanic, the lifeboat drills were also accustomed on White Star Liner vessels. The drills would have occurred on a Sunday during the voyage, and Captain Smith religiously held both fire and lifeboat drills every Sunday. But this could only be done if the weather was calm and clear. And with strong winds, lives could have been at risk and would be dangerous to lower a few lifeboats. However, it is understood that the reason for the cancellation wasn't told to all crew members. Fireman William Taylor stated that he did not know why a lifeboat drill took place, as usually, lifeboat drills on vessels would have been compulsory. Maybe the captain only told the Titanic's 6 lookouts and close crew members instead, and the others who got told about the cancellation as an announcement instead of one explaining why. If there was another date where a drill would have been held, it could have occurred on the 15th, which could ultimately delay Titanic's arrival by a date at most, or when the Titanic would have arrived in New York City, similar to when a drill was held in Southampton on the 10th. Whatever the case would be, likely we will never know what would have happened if the Titanic hadn't sunk. But other events hadn't been delayed. A schedule had been planned where a few activities were to take place. In first class, a dog show had been arranged for Monday evening. On the Titanic, it is believed that there were a certain number of animals including cats, a canary, chickens, and 12 dogs, all belonging to first class passengers. The most famous dog on the Titanic was a black French bulldog named Gamin de Picomme, which belonged to Robert Williams Daniel, who bought the champion dog during his stay in England, paying 150 British pounds for the pooch. In today's currency, it would be over 103,000 British pounds. The ship would have had kennel facilities on the boat deck after the number 4 funnel, and they would have been looked after by the Titanic's butchers, including Chief Butcher Alfred Maiden. At Maiden's care, he and the butchers would have kept the dogs in their kennels, but he would take the dog strolls on the boat deck and would allow them to have a bathroom break once a day. Although Maiden had access to the kennels, he was known to have passengers allowed to see the dogs on board. One of the passengers he allowed to see the dogs was second-class passenger Ayla Hart, who was 7 years old at the time, recalling the voyage in an interview. She discussed meeting Daniel's dog in a row of kennels and cages with the other dogs next to a small canine. They weren't roaming about, they were all in a row of kennels and cages and things at the end of the ship, and there was one little French bulldog that I took a great fancy to and my father was quite friendly with. I think one of the crews who looked after them, and every day he used to let me go down and play with this little dog. And from that day to this, they have been my favorite bulldogs, the French bulldogs. Ava also loved to sing. Her mother, Esther, will recall her enthusiasm for singing a hymn during one of the Sunday services, and later that day, mother and daughter had decided to participate in a charity gala concert where they was sung alongside a small orchestra. The orchestra, who were employed by C.W. and F.N. Black of Liverpool, were supposed to perform tunes for the gala with volunteers to sing along with them, including the Harts. The gala was in aid of the sailors' home in Liverpool. Later in the day at 5 p.m., the Titanic was reportedly supposed to have turned at a location known as the Corner, which was located at 42 degrees north and 47 degrees west, but Captain Smith decided to change course, leading the Titanic travel through an ice field, and around by 5:50 p.m., the ship turned from south 62 degrees to south 86 degrees west, heading north-south 71 degrees west. Around the time of the course change, the temperature was at 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and by 7:15 p.m., it sharply dropped to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, which became noticeable to the passengers. At 6 p.m., Second Officer Charles Lightoller would begin his evening watch on board the bridge. Lightoller remained on duty for 4 hours, even when he had his dinner. But the duties of a second officer weren't nearly straightforward, for he and a handful of the officers who were continuously aware of the weather and the telegrams of ice warnings that were positioned in the chart room. In an interview he gave to the BBC radio program I Was There in 1936, Lightoller described the scenario of the night and how officers were aware of the dangers of the ice fields.
On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of the year, and had taken all necessary precautions.
However, it is noted that not all precautions were taken, particularly in the chart room. According to a few sources, it was noted that 5th Officer Lowe didn't pay much attention to the coordinates of ice that were sent on the telegram from the Corona onto the chart room table, as there was no signature of who had written the coordinates for the telegram. In another source, 3rd Officer Pittman noticed several coordinates that were marked, assuming they had been noted by 4th Officer Boxhall or 6th Officer Moody. There was either confusion or a lack of communication on the bridge, but what the case is, there's a chance that no conclusion to explain the officer's actions throughout the 14th of April. By 7 p.m., the temperature jumped down from 43 degrees to 33 degrees, but the weather was recorded as being clear and calm despite the Titanic steaming through an Arctic high-pressure system. Around the same time, first-class passengers were beginning to have their dinner. This included Bruce Ismay, who was still carrying the telegram from the Baltic in his pocket. By the evening, he was reported to be in the first-class smoking room, where Captain Smith asked if Ismay could hand the telegram from the Baltic so he could post the message in the chart room, to which he did before Ismay and the captain left for dinner at the Alicari restaurant, sitting at different tables. While the crew were on duty and the passengers were enjoying their meals, Junior Wireless Operator Harold Bride received a telegram in the late afternoon while he was on duty in the Marconi Wireless Room. The telegram he received was from the Leyland liner, the SS Californian, where the operator, Cyril Evans, was sending warnings of ice. Bride gave evidence in the United States inquiry where he explained that although a message had been sent through the captain in the early evening, he wasn't sure who that message was from. Did you ever talk with the captain about such a message? There was a message delivered to the captain in the afternoon, sir. Late in the afternoon regarding a Sunday? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Regarding the ice field. From whom? From the Californian, sir. At what hour Sunday? It might not have been the Californian, but I gave you the call signal of the ship. It is MWL. You can ascertain that later. Go ahead. I received that message myself and delivered it to the captain. It stated that there were 3 large icebergs that the ship had just passed, and it gave their position. What was the hour of the day? Late in the afternoon, but I cannot say the hour of the day. Dusk? It was an unofficial message. From whom was it? From this ship. The Californian? The ship with that call signal, MWL. Which was the code signal? The code signal of the ship. Are you familiar with the code signals? I know a few good of them. Do you know what that means? That particular call sign means a certain ship. Yes, I want to know that ship. It was clear that until Bride and Senator Smith were told that the ship was the Californian, Bride didn't take the Californian's message. However, Evans did transmit the message to the Baltic and her wireless operator, Henry J. Tattersall, as Evans didn't call Bride again. Bride then goes on to say that she transmitted the ice report to the Baltic, and as she was transmitting it to the Baltic, I took it down. I took it to the captain, but it was not official because it was not intended for me afterwards. This is likely the one message that was in the possession of Ismay when he was shown the telegram to the passengers before the captain requested for the message to be returned to be put in the chart room. However, Bride admitted that he didn't look to see the Californian signals because he was writing accounts on the operating table. By the early evening, he was relieved by Jack Phillips, who by then was exhausted from the event that happened with the apparatus the night before. Dinner began at 7:15 p.m. for the first-class passengers, particularly in the Alicari, where Captain Smith was the guest of honor of a special dinner party hosted by the Winders. The guests include John and Marion Thayer, though their son Jack Thayer was in a dining saloon with his friend Milton Law. In Cafe Parisian, Colonel Archibald Gracie, Helen Churchill Candy, Edward Kent, Hugh Woolner, Edward Colley, James Clinch Smith, and Morris Stephenson were in mid-conversation discussing Gracie's new book that he mentioned to Isidore Strauss in the first-class library while dining in the lavish meals including cream of barley soup, oysters, roast duckling, chocolate, and vanilla eclairs. Later on, Gracie Smith went to the palm room for after-dinner coffee, and the pair heard music from the orchestra before Gracie Smith joined Spencer V. Silverthorne, Hugh Woolner, Lucien P. Smith, Paul Chavert, and A.F. Amont for a game of cards in the Cafe Parisian. They would stay in the cafe until 11:30 p.m. when the men moved to the first-class smoking room when the temperature dropped to 31 degrees and the cafe became freezing to continue playing cards. In second class, a Sunday evening service was occurred in the second-class dining saloon and was hosted by Reverend Ernest Carter. According to Lawrence Beasley, Carter had made a request had been made to use the saloon for a hymn sing-song, which was granted. Before the service, the traditional concert by the orchestra was performed, and Kate Buss, who would recall later that she had requested a song for the orchestra to play while volunteering to run the subscription, were tips for them. One of the band members, John Woodward, granted her wish, and altogether the gentlemen played Near My God to Thee. Afterwards, Woodward said to Miss Buss that she could continue to run the subscription around each night for the orchestra before the end of the voyage. Following a concert involving the orchestra, the evening service began with Robert Douglas Norman playing the piano, R. Alfred Payne playing the flute, and the attendees include Kate Buss singing hymns, including Eternal Father, Strong to Save, before Father Joseph Purchas, forgive me for butchering his name, finished with a prayer, praying to God to protect the beautiful Titanic forever. In third class, there was a party gathering where Eugene Dolly played his pipes in the third-class general room, and the open space provided passengers with musical entertainment like it had been every single day and night during the voyage. At times, the music down in the third class would reach other areas like the second-class rooms. In his own memoir, Lawrence Beasley recalled that he enjoyed listening to the music from third class, but he was very critical about Daly's pipes, and so were the postal clerks, who thought they might have been too loud. Before 9 p.m., Captain Edward J. Smith returned to the bridge following his meal in the Alicante restaurant, where he was met with Charles Lightoller and 6th Officer James Moody. When the captain returned to the bridge, there were many stars in the sky, but the Titanic was sailing on a calm, moonless night. Like the passengers and his crew, Smith too noticed the plummet, and he remarked on the temperature, which was by now 31 degrees. However, Lightoller believed that the stars would create reflected light from any icebergs that were nearby, despite only one warning that had been posted in the chart room earlier that day from the Coronia. None of the officers were aware of the dangers of icebergs. At 9:20 p.m., Smith left the bridge, only to give these instructions to Lightoller: "If in the slightest degree doubtful, let me know." At 9:30 p.m., he gave instructions to 6th Officer Mooney to telephone the Crow's Nest and ask the lookouts for small ice. At 10 p.m., Lightoller was relieved by 1st Officer William Murdoch. Around the same time that Lightoller was relieved, passengers and some of the crew members were settling down for the night. Eugene Dowley would have retired for down in third class. There was a curfew, bedtime was at 10 p.m., and anyone who stayed up late would be in serious trouble, though it didn't matter as the rules would have been broken. James McGann would have retired to bed if it completed the third watch in the boiler rooms at 8 p.m. or if he was asleep, having to get up early to start the first watch at 8 a.m., or he might have continued working alongside the other stokers like Frederick Barrett. Again, there's no record what exactly happened to him during the entire voyage. Jack Thayer and Milton Long continued pleasuring each other's companies with coffee before taking a stroll around on the boat deck before Milton retired to bed. Before he went to bed himself, Jack would recall Titanic's last night on the sea and weather. It was a brilliant, starry night. There was no moon, and I would never seen the stars shine brighter. They appeared to stand right out of the sky, sparkling like cut diamonds. A very light haze, hardly noticeable, hung over the low waters. The winds whistled through the stays, and blackish smoke poured out of the 3 funnels. It was kind of a night that made one feel glad to be alive. Down in the Marconi wireless room, Harold Bride was taking a nap in the sleeping quarters while Jack Phillips was working on a backlog of messages to send to Cape Race. At 9:25 p.m., he responded to a message from the SS Mezaba, who delivered an ice report where the crew saw heavy pack ice, large bergs, and field ice. However, this message was never delivered to the bridge, and it is possible that the ice report was misplaced elsewhere. Phillips' concentration was out of place, having little sleep. In his book, Titanic and Other Ships by Charles Lightoller, will go on to explain what happened when he asked Phillips where was the ice report from the Mezaba. Phillips explained, "When I said I did not recall any Mezaba report, I just put the message under a paperweight at my elbow, just until I squared up what I was doing before sending it to the bridge. That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause of the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives. Had I, as officer of the watch or the captain, become aware of the peril lying so close ahead and not instantly slowed down or stopped, we should have been guilty of culpable and criminal negligence. Criminal negligence or not, it is possible we might never know what happened to the ice report from the Mezaba." What also happened was Phillips feeling stressed, which led him to snap after listening to a message from the Leyland ship, the Californian. At the time of the incident, Phillips and Bride agreed to work in separate shifts. Jack Phillips would take the 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. shifts, and Harold Bride would take the 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. shifts. But because of the incident with the Marconi apparatus the night before, Phillips got so little sleep. However, it's unclear whether he decided to take a break or work under his and Bride's shifts. What we do know was that while Phillips was listening to a telegram message for Miss Dorothy Gibson from Cape Race, Marconi number MCE, at 10:55 p.m., the SS Californian's operator, Cyril Evans, sent a message to Phillips saying, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." When the message was sent, the signal from the Californian was so strong that it deafened Phillips' ears. The reason for this was that the Californian signal was so close to the signal tower at Cape Race, which was several hundred miles away. In addition to this, both the Titanic and the Californian were using spark gap wireless sets, making signals strong and loud. In response, Phillips snapped by Evans saying, "I am busy, I am working Cape Race, you're jamming my signal." Afterwards, Phillips apologized to Cape Race, telling the operators of the signal tower to Please repeat, jammed. Following the incident, Evans turned in for the night and shut down the Californian's apparatus, and this would be the ultimate turning point in maritime history. At 11:39 p.m., 7 sharp clangs were heard in the Titanic's crow's nest, followed by sounds of frustration and panic from the lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lead. Seconds earlier, the men were in the middle of their 2-hour shift when, in the middle of the haze in the Atlantic Ocean, Fleet spotted a black mass ahead, and that was an iceberg. Before the iceberg, Fleet and Lee relieved 2 other lookouts named Archie Jewell and George Simons, where Simons advised the pair to keep a sharp lookout for ice. However, despite the warning, and the weather was clear and calm on a moonless night, the haze made it impossible to see the icebergs in the lane where the Titanic was sailing in. So by the time the iceberg was spotted, Fleet knew he had to act quickly. After clanging the bell on the bell and telephoning the bridge, an answer to Fleet's call came from 6th Officer James Moody. When Moody picked up the telephone, Fleet cried, "Are you there?" Officer Moody replied, "Yes, what do you see?" Fleet cried out the infamous words, "Iceberg, right ahead." When Moody told First Officer William Murdoch, Murdoch gave the order hard to starboard and closed the watertight compartments. But the actions came too little too late. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic scraped alongside the iceberg on her starboard side. The collision had opened multiple small seams between her hull plates. Helplessly watching the events unfold, Lee saw the Titanic turning to port while Fleet was still on the telephone. Lee briefly fled inside the crow's nest as he was afraid they would hit the iceberg at a close distance. Both men saw ice falling onto the decks. Down below, some passengers and the crew were welcomed by the jolt of a collision.
But it's depending where you were on the vessel. If you were lower down in the bows of the ship and if you was further forward, you would have felt it a lot more than people that were further back or in the middle of the ship or higher up. I know that Lawrence Beasley said that it was more like a heave of the engines, just nothing more than a heave of the engines, because he had a glass of water on the side cabinet next to his bed, and he said that the water just shook, but it wasn't a violent shaking. It wasn't like anything out of the ordinary. Now, for people in, like, say, the bows of the ship, if you was further forward where the actual collision took place, if you was on the starboard side, generally you'd have felt it violently. But some people didn't really react at all.
However, the first to spot signs of trouble were the trimmers and firemen like James McGann and leading fireman Frederick Barrett. In his testimony from the British Commissioner's inquiry, Barrett would describe the impact that occurred in the number 6 boiler room and the number 10 stokehold during and following the collision. At the time, he was talking to engineering crew member John Hesketh when he saw something unusual. Now just tell us what happened that you noticed. There was like a clock rigged up in the stokehold, and a red light goes up when the ship is supposed to stop, a white light for full speed, and I think it is a blue light for slow. This red light came up. I am the man in charge of the watch, and I called out, "Shut all the dampers." You saw this red light? Yes. You knew that was an order to stop the engines. It says stop. A red piece of glass and an electric light inside. Shutting the dampers, I suppose, would be to shut the wind off the fires. To shut the draft off the fires, and you gave an order, shut the dampers? Yes. Was that order obeyed? Yes. What was the next thing that happened? The crash came before we had them all shut. They were shutting them when the crash came? Yes. Where was the crash? What was it you felt or heard or saw? Water came pouring in 2 feet above the stokehold plate. The ship's side was torn from the third stokehold to the forward end. We will get this slowly, because it is important. Just let us have that again. You said something about the water coming in? Yes. Did it came in on you? Yes. Where did the water come from? Well, out of the sea, I expect. I want to know where it came from. Underneath or from the side, from the port side, or from the starboard side? The starboard side. Can you tell us that all compared to where you were standing when it came from above or below? About 2 feet from where I was standing. It isn't clear where James McGann was at the time of the collision, but there is a possibility that he was either in his quarters on duty in the same stokehold as Barrett. According to Barrett, at the time of collision, Barrett was with Hesketh, 7 other firemen, and 4 coal trimmers. It is a possible one of them could have been McGann. But since McGann wasn't called to participate in the American or British inquiries, we cannot be for certain where he was at the time. What we do know is that most of the trimmers and firemen instantly saw the bow flooding beneath the foredeck where their quarters were. Once the water was increasing, many made their way to the boat deck carrying their kits with them. Following the collision and Murdoch's actions to close the watertight doors, Captain Edward J. Smith, emerging from his quarters, had arrived on deck and was given the news of the collision. A little before 11:45 p.m., the Titanic's engines were set to half ahead. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall started an investigation into the damage as the time went on. He discovered that the incident was a serious one, as he explained in an interview for the BBC in 1962.
Whilst the captain was talking to Murdoch at the starboard wing of the bridge, I slipped down to go forward and have a look to see if I could find any damage. Nobody told me to go. You had to go down about 4 bridge ladders, you see. And I went forward to the entrance to the third class. These third-class passengers, Southern European people, were streaming up on deck, and I went down below. I think it was 2 decks down, as low as I could go without removing any hatches or anything. I went down to the third class, crossed over to the starboard side, and I walked along there and looked in the cross passages. I couldn't hear any noise. I couldn't see any damage. And I eventually came up on deck again. As I was emerging on the deck, some of these men were on their way back again to their beds. And there was one man had a piece of ice, and I took it away out of his hands, wondering where he got it from. And I spoke to him in English and tried to make him understand that it was nothing, there was nothing the matter. Go down and go to bed and go to sleep again, you see. And I took this piece of ice and walked along the upper deck on the starboard side to see where the ice came from. And there, just inside of the ship's rail, there was a powdering of ice running along as though she'd compressed it. There was no wind, you see, and it would fall inboard. I came up onto the bridge again and reported to the captain, I've been down below, sir, right down as far as I could go without removing hatches or tarpaulins or anything, right through the third class accommodation forward. And I don't see any signs of any damage, not even a glass port broken. He said, did you see the carpenter anywhere, Mr. Boxall? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I do wish you would go down and find him and tell him to sound the ship round for and let me know right away. Well, I didn't get down all the ladders down to the foredeck. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast. So I said, all right, go along, carpenter. The captain is on the starboard wing of the bridge, and tell the captain. I didn't get down to the foredeck because I met a mail clerk coming up. And he said, Mr. Boxall, the mail room's filling. So I said, oh, carry on, and you'll find the captain on the starboard wing of the bridge and report to him. I said, I'll go down there and have a look. So I continued on my way down to the mail room. I tried to go into the first class entrance from that lower deck, from the foredeck, but they'd got the watertight door closed. I had to come up all these ladders and go up over the promenade deck and then down through the main saloon entrance, where I found the band was beginning to tune up. And I got my way down to the mail room, and I got down as far as the sorting room, and all the mail clerks were there pulling letters out of the racks. And I was standing on the top of a companionway from the sorting room down to the handing room. And I saw a bag floating by. I instinctively stooped down to try and pick it up. I just couldn't reach it. I realized then that it was serious.
At 11:46 p.m., the Titanic came to a sudden stop. While some of the people below were aware of what was going on, most of the passengers, particularly in the first and second classes, were unaware of the situation. They only became concerned when they noticed the engines had stopped and excess steam came through the funnels, which gave a roar and hissing steam. However, some on the starboard felt the collision, including Colonel Archibald Gracie. Upon hearing this collision, he turned on the electric light, glancing at his watch on the dresser table. Later on, he heard the steam and noticed that the engines had stopped. The colonel got dressed in his cabin before he went up to the boat deck. Not long after, he jumped over the barrier dividing first and second class areas before he encountered the White Star chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, and a crew member upon his return to A deck. They failed to notice Gracie. However, Clint Smith did, and when he saw Gracie, he held up a piece of ice in front of his friend. It was then that Gracie had learned that the mailroom flooding and the postal clerks who were attempting to move 200 bags of registered mail. Learning the truth of the situation, Gracie returned to his stateroom where he packed his possessions in 3 large bags ready for a ship transfer. He also put on his life jacket. While sleeping in his cabin, Charles Lightoller felt a small vibration. In his interview, Lightoller describes what happened next.
I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited. If I was wanted, naturally my cabin would be the first place where anyone sent for me would look. You see, apart from being nearly frozen, even an officer, when off watch, isn't exactly welcomed on the bridge, either in pajamas or anything else. Anyway, it wasn't long before Boxall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, "Do you know we've struck an iceberg?" "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking it anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater, and bridge coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was. Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve. And as a result, the steam roared off at all exhausts. The row was absolutely deafening. Added to that, the engineers started to blow the boilers down. Shout as loud as you like. No one could hear a word.
On C deck, Jack Thayer was in his room when he heard a scraping sound when the Titanic veered to port. Later, he would go on to describe what he had noticed and what he did next. The sudden quiet was startling and disturbing, like the subdued quiet in a sleeping car, at a stop after a continuous run. Not a sound except the breeze whistling through the half-open port. Then there was a distant noise of running feet and muffled voices as several people hurried through the passageway. Very shortly the engines started up again, slowly, not with the bright vibration to which we were accustomed, but as thought they were tired. After a very few revolutions, they again stopped. I hurried into my heavy overcoat and drew on my slippers, all excited, but not thinking anything serious had occurred. I called in to my father and mother that I was going up on deck to see the fun. Father said he would put on his clothes and come up and join me. It was bitterly cold. I walked around on the deck looking over the side from time to time. As far as I could see, there was nothing to be seen except something scattered on the well deck forward, which I afterwards learned was ice. There was no sign of any large iceberg. Only 2 or 3 people were on deck when I arrived, but many rapidly gathered. My father joined me very soon. He and I moved around on deck trying to discover what had happened and finally found one of the crew who told us we had hit an iceberg. The ship took on a very slight list starboard. We did not know it was at that moment, but we learned afterwards that the iceberg had ripped open possibly 4 of her larger forward compartments on the starboard side, and also that if we had only hit the ice head-on, instead of making too late an attempt to avoid it, the ship would all in probability have survived the collision. About 15 minutes after the collision, she developed a list to port and was distinctively down by the head. Charles was down on E deck, sleeping in his cabin when he was awakened by the violent impact. Immediately, he rose from his bunk and began to make his way to the baker's shop with his staff. Earlier, Chief Night Baker Walter Belford was making rolls for tomorrow's meals, but the jolt made a new pan of rolls to scatter all over the floor. But despite the loss of the freshly made rolls, though, Charles and his staff had received word from the top deck that an order has been given for spare bread from the baker's shop to be sent up to the top deck to be put into lifeboats. It's not clear where the order came from. In the end, the 13 men and Yalkin managed to retrieve 40 pounds of bread to take onto the top deck. On E deck, Sidney Daniels was in his bunk, sleeping when he learned about what happened after being distributed from his slumber. In an interview recorded on the 17th of November 1982, Daniels would describe what happened when the collision took place. Until the Sunday evening, everything went all smooth and quiet, and about 11:30 or 11:20, I was in my bunk sleeping. The night watchman came down and said, "All hands on deck and life belts on." We thought it was an emergency boat drill. We weren't very pleased with it, so anyway, we eventually went up on deck and were stood by our boats. Down below in the Marconi room, Harold Pry got up from his bunk and got dressed. Bride saw Jack Phillips overworking himself before he stood by him. At 12:15 a.m. on the 15th of April, both men saw Captain Edward J. Smith sticking his head in the Marconi wireless room just as Bride told Phillips to go to bed. When both men saw the captain, Bride recalled the captain instructing the men, "We've struck an iceberg, and I'm having an inspection made to tell what it has done for us. You had better get ready to send out a call for assistance, but don't send it until I tell you." 15 minutes earlier, before Bride and Phillips received the news, third-class passenger Eugene Dowley was trying to find a lifebelt, sensing that there was danger. Dowley was awoken by a loud crash from the collision between the Titanic and the iceberg and feeling alarmed. He got up, got dressed, and looked out into the corridor. While looking, he met a steward who said that everything was okay and advised him to go back to bed. However, after returning to his bunk, he began to hear more people running and increasing voices of concern. He left his cabin, leaving his pipes behind. The pipes would later go down with the Titanic. Dowley would fetch 2 female passengers and escort them to the communal steerage areas. However, stewards told him that there was no danger. Dowley attempted to fetch a lifebelt, but an identified man surrendered it to one of the women, Margaret Dowley. Around the same time, 4th Officer Boxhall runs back to the bridge and makes a report to Captain Smith about the situation with the flooding. Where the water is rising too high as F deck, it was only then that any hope for the ship to remain afloat was fading away. At around 10:05 a.m., 10 minutes before Captain Smith made his way to the Marconi wireless room, 2nd Officer Charles Lightoller sprang into action, putting on a pair of trousers, a sweater, and a white muffler on top of his pajamas before he ran onto the boat deck where the captain gave Lightoller and the other officers an order to swing out the lifeboats. The captain also told Lightoller to run to the port side to supervise the loading of 8 lifeboats. However, Lightoller didn't believe the ship was sinking. As the lifeboats were swung out and the canvases were uncovered, some of the first and second class passengers were gathered up in the public spaces, wondering what was going on. However, the elevator in second class, which ran from the boat deck to F deck, wasn't functioning. Second class passenger Lawrence Beasley would later recall how he noticed that his feet weren't quite landing where they should on the staircase. On the boat deck, Lightoller was helping to prepare the lifeboats when, while steam was continuing to escape from the funnels, he asked Captain Smith for instruction.
When the boats were stripped and cleared, they were swung out and lowered to the level of the boat deck. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat.
It's likely that not long after Lightoller's question, Captain Smith went to the Marconi room to tell the operators the news. Not long after that, the orchestra began to play in the reception room on D deck, on top in the grand staircase. When the orchestra was playing, at around 12:15 a.m., Jack Thayer and John B. Thayer were making their way inside the first-class lounge on A deck when they bumped into the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews Jr., White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay, and some of the officers. When they saw Andrews and asked him what had happened, Andrews gave the Thayers the bad news. The Titanic would sink and had less than 2 hours to live. Immediately, the Thayers met with Margaret Fleming and Miriam Thayer in their staterooms, got fully dressed, and put on their life jackets before returning to the lounge where he was reunited with Milton Long, who joined the family. After being joined up by some of the ladies and looking for his friends, Colonel Archibald Gracie had met up with racket coach Frederick Wright after a midnight run on C deck. Noticing his reaction to the situation, Gracie made a joke by canceling his session in the squash court, which had been arranged for 7:30 a.m. Wright wasn't in a laughable mood as the water was flooding the squash court by this time. It was then that Gracie walked up to A deck where he found his friend Clinch Smith. He and the ladies he accompanied, and Smith had noticed a tilt, realized how the situation was. He returned to his stateroom to pack his possessions into 3 large traveling bags and put on a long Newmarket overcoat. When he returned to A deck, Gracie saw that there was a crowd of people who were beginning to put on life belts. He returned to his room for one last time before returning to the deck with his life belt. Not long after Gracie received his life belt, at 12:30 a.m., Chief Baker Charles Yalkin and his team were onto the boat deck where they gave all the bread that was left in the baker's shop and put them inside all the 16 regular lifeboats. But while the lifeboats were in the final stages of preparation, there were mixed reviews on the situation of the Titanic's injury. While Thomas Andrews knew the ship was dying, some of the officers who were unaware of the situation knew that everything was alright. In the second-class promenade, some officers walked up and down screaming to concerned passengers, "There's no danger." However, at 12:30 a.m., Andrews was seen briskly making his way to the bridge. He was seen feeling worried and his face was pale white, which indicated the worst, and his previous conversation with the Thayer family 6 minutes earlier meant that the Titanic hadn't long to live. 2 minutes later on the bridge, he informs Captain Smith that the water was still flooding in boiler room number 5, and as a result of that, the first 5 compartments were gravitating down below the waves at a rapid pace and were settling down by the head. In conclusion, Andrews had shared the dreaded results that the Titanic would sink in an hour, possibly in an hour and a half. 2 at the most. After having his ideas of requesting more lifeboats and other safety measures over a year before, his nightmare had become a reality. A sinking ship with lifeboat seats for only half the capacity of persons on board. It was thought that not long after receiving the news from Andrews, the captain gave the order to launch the lifeboats immediately. 4th Officer Boxhall then mistakenly gave incorrect coordinates to Captain Smith, who made his way to the Marconi wireless room. At 12:26 a.m., he put his head through the door where he gave the coordinates to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. In his testimony, Bride would recall the conversation between his colleague and the captain. "Send a call for assistance," ordered the captain, barely putting his head in the door. "What call should I send?" Phillips asked. "The regulation international call for help." Just that. Then the captain was gone. 1 minute later, Phillips sent out the first distress call. "CQD, CQD, MGY, MGY. Require assistance 41 degrees 44 north, 50 degrees 24 west." It didn't take long before he would have responses from Cape Race and 10 ships including the Frankfurt and the Mount Temple. Not long after receiving a message from the Frankfurt, Bride went to the bridge at 12:30 a.m. to find Captain Smith on the officer's promenade deck. Once he met with the captain, Bride said to him, "Sir, we made contact with a German ship. It's the Frankfurt." Hoping to find more information, the captain asked, "What is her position?" "We will get that as soon as we can, sir," replied Bride before he returned to the Marconi room. At the same time, Chief Baker Charles Yalkin decided to retire to his cabin on E deck after he had finished delivering the bread on A deck. When he made his way down, he noticed the third-class women come along Scotland Road whilst carrying their belongings and an interpreter steward attempting to navigate non-English speaking passengers their way to the boats at the aft end. However, some women were being difficult. So in desperation, and after drinking 1 glass of port, he forcibly hauled up women to the promenade deck. Oh, Charles. A little while later, Captain Smith had ordered all ladies on deck. However, 4th Officer Boxhall realized that the first coordinates he wrote were incorrect. He made a hasty decision to correct this mistake, as the Titanic was 20 miles ahead of her original position. He wrote down the new position, 41 degrees 46 north, 50 degrees 14 west. At 12:36 a.m., he made his way to the Marconi wireless room. In his 1962 interview with BBC Radio, Boxhall would describe what he saw upon entering the wireless room.
Phillips, the wireless operator, was bending over his instrument, the telephone, holding the telephone. He says, I'm in contact with the Carpathia. Well, I put the amended position down on the desk, and I said, now send that amended position. Do you understand? He said, yes. Well, I said, send that off right away. And that was the position that the Carpathia came to.
Before Boxhall had entered, Jack Phillips had found contact with a Cunard liner, the RMS Carpathia, who was heading towards Fiume, Austria-Hungary, which is now present-day Rijeka, Croatia. Unaware of the situation, the Carpathia's operator, Harold Cottam, tried to contact Phillips by saying, MPA to MGY, do you know that MCC Cape Cod is sending a batch of messages for you? In a response, Phillips messaged, MGY to MPA, come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man. Position 41 degrees 46 north, 50-14 west. In shock, Cottam quickly asked, shall I tell my captain? Do you require assistance? Yes, replied Phillips. Come quick.